I took my first serious dedicated photography road trip back in 2017. I spent a week driving around Slovenia and it was amazing. And ever since then, I've spent several weeks and sometimes several months out of each year on the road in search of photos. I've found that road trips are usually a really good tool for travel photography. Many of my best images have come from these photo road trips that I've taken in the past 7 years, but it's also taken me a while to really dial in my process and figure out the best way to approach them. So in this video, I wanted to walk through 7 rules that I've given myself for making the most of travel photography road trips, making sure that I come back with good images, that I don't burn myself out, and that I enjoy myself along the way. I think road trips are a really good tool for travel photography, but you have to set your expectations right, because sometimes it can feel like not very much is happening. You're just driving a lot. But I always find that at the end of a few days or however long the road trip is, I look back and it might feel like I didn't take that many photos or that I didn't get very many good photos. But I always end up with a decent selection of images at the end that tell the story of the place well. So it really just takes some patience and trusting the process. But you do have to be patient. You're spending a lot of time out there and you're covering a lot of ground. And at least for me, the goal isn't to get 100 good photos per day. So that means that there are inevitably going to be hours at a time, or maybe even an entire day sometimes, where it doesn't really seem like very much is happening. And I have to remember that that's okay. That's part of the process. With any road trip, there are going to be up and down periods, and that doesn't mean that you're not a good photographer, that you're an imposter, that the trip is a waste of time. But you have to just trust the process. Thinking back on all of these trips that I've done, northern Spain, there was an entire day where the entire content of the vlog that I made was just, I drove today. And it's been a while, so I don't remember exactly what I was thinking, but it was probably stressful. I was probably stressed about it because I was just driving all day. You know, what am I going to do for the behind the scenes video? When am I going to take a good picture again? Especially if it's a solo road trip and you're in the car by yourself and you take your photography really seriously like me. I've found that it's easy to get in your head and get impatient during the slow periods. The year before in Newfoundland, it just poured rain for an entire day, and it even snowed pretty hard on another day of the trip, and I didn't do much photography at all for long stretches of time there. But at the end of each of those trips, I came home with a big selection of images that I loved and that showed the place well. So you just have to trust the process. You're spending a lot of time out there, you're going to get good photos. Photograph what's there, not what you wish was there. You're going to show up to places and be like, the light's kind of crap. I wish I was here for sunset, or I wish there was like a cloud inversion or something like that. But it's a road trip, so you're probably moving along pretty soon, and you just kind of have to be okay with that. Just treat it like it's a sampler trip. Just photograph what's there, how it's there, and don't try to make it what it's not. If it's a sunny day, photograph it like it's a sunny day, edit it like it's a sunny day. You're telling the story of the place as you saw it. And then if there's a photo that you see that you want to shoot in different conditions, well, use this as the location scouting trip, especially if it's a place that's reasonably close to home or that you know that you'll go back to. And then on the next trip there, just hang out in that area for a couple of days and make sure that you get the shot that you want. But on your first trip to a new area, or when you're just doing a photography road trip, just photograph what's there. Now, maybe you only like to shoot in golden hour, or you're like an astrophotographer and that's your style of photography, that's all you do. Fine, these are just rules that I've made for myself because I find that they work well for me. And I like approaching travel photography from a broader perspective and photographing in all sorts of light. But if that's not for you, then just take or leave any of this advice. They're not hard and fast rules that'll work for everyone. But for most people who want to get the most out of a photography trip, I think it's pretty good advice. The real trick with road trips is that you have to get out of the car. That might sound kind of obvious, but even if you show up at a spot and you're like, I don't really see anything from the parking spot, the light doesn't seem very exciting, just get out of the car, just take your camera for a walk and see what you find. Because once you're in the car, once you're driving, it can be really easy for that momentum to just keep you driving. You're making progress toward the destination. It feels like that's the right thing to do, but that's not the point of a road trip. The car and the road trip are just tools to get you to places, but you have to get to those places, and then you have to get out of the car and walk around, because otherwise you might just end up doing a lot of driving. You might come home without many photos to show for it. And most of the time, when I don't really feel like it, and I get out of the car anyway, and I go for a wander for a bit, even if the light isn't super exciting, most of the time I'll usually find something interesting. Maybe not every time, but enough to where it's definitely worth just getting in that habit. You have to get into what I call noticing mode to make good, interesting, deep photos of a place. And you generally can't do that as well from inside of a car. It's just not the right environment for that. So just get out and walk for a few minutes and see what you can find. You might be surprised. There's this romantic idea with a road trip of just getting in the car and going where the road takes you. And some people like that, but over the years, I've found that having done some research ahead of time and saving some possible locations to Google Maps or wherever works for you, you don't have to do all of them, but they're just possible locations. That's really helpful because then you're not having to build the entire trip from scratch as you go. I've done that too, and it's kind of fun, but it's also kind of exhausting. And I think it's better to save your time and your energy for actually exploring. So you can use those places that you've saved ahead of time as a starting point. And then if you see something else that catches your eye, you can ignore all of your plans and go check that out instead. But at least you have a starting point. Because otherwise you might just find yourself driving around, not sure where you're going. And especially if you have any degree of limited time, which most of us do unless you live in a van full time or something, I've always found that to be a little bit stressful. So your mileage may vary on that, and it probably depends on your style of photography too, and again, whether you live full-time on the road or not. But for most of us, that's not the case. And I think doing a little bit of planning balances well with the spontaneity. So I found that to be really helpful. If possible, take the back roads. It's one thing to just be trying to get somewhere as quickly as possible, and you can almost always get there faster on the highways. There's definitely a time and a place for that. But for me, that's not really a road trip. That's just driving somewhere. A road trip, for me, is about the places that you see along the way, not just the final destination. So the scenic route, the back roads, it's slower, but it's almost definitely more interesting. And compared to a highway, at least, it's usually easier to pull over if you do see something that catches your eye. So take the back roads whenever you can. You need snacks, of course, it's a road trip, but you also need some backup meals, because you might find yourself at a cool spot doing some photography around dinner or something, especially if the sunset light happens to be right around dinner time. And you don't want to have to leave that spot to go find a restaurant, especially if there isn't one nearby. In general, I don't think that it makes a ton of sense to spend that much time cooking on road trips, especially if it's like a focused, dedicated photography road trip. It's better to spend that time and that energy driving, exploring, and on the photography itself. But it's good to have some backup options in case you're in a spot and you need some food. I remember I was on my Newfoundland road trip a handful of years ago, and I was on this tiny island off the coast of Newfoundland called Fogo Island. I don't remember the specifics because it's been a while, but basically it was late at night and there weren't a lot of food options because it was kind of off season. It was late at night and there just aren't a lot of restaurants on Fogo Island, or at least there weren't back then. And I had to just scramble for food. I think I ate a granola bar that I found in the car and maybe a bag of chips that I got at a grocery store or a gas station or something. But ever since then, I've made sure to have lots of snacks and just backpacking meals or sandwich makings or something like that in the car, just so that I don't have to go off searching for food if the light's nice or if I happen to be in a spot where there's just not a lot of restaurants. But in general, you want to be somewhat self-sufficient with food and water so that those don't become the limiting factor on a trip. I've found that there are different strategies for different length road trips. and you have to pace yourself accordingly. Your energy levels are going to be different from mine, but if it's a 3-day road trip, for example, I can go pretty much all out from sunrise to sunset, just constantly on the move, but then I just absolutely crash when I get home. But if I'm on an 8-day road trip or multiple weeks or even longer, I find that I have to force myself to build in rest periods. And if you're at all like me, that might feel like a waste of time in the moment because you're here, you're spending time and your money and probably limited amounts of both to be here, wherever that is. But you also don't want to burn out, so you have to rest. So if the weather is nice and sunny, it probably makes sense to take some rest periods during the middle of the day. If it's overcast and rainy, then maybe the timing doesn't matter as much, so you just rest when you're tired or call it a day before it gets dark, or maybe you take an entire day off and just hang in a coffee shop or something. For me, this is really hard. I feel like I should always be on the go. I take my photography really seriously, and I have a hard time resting when I'm on a dedicated solo trip. But it's important to avoid burnout and to protect my energy level so that I can be creative and I'm not just a walking zombie wandering around and without the energy to be creative and only able to take the obvious photos of a place. So those are a few rules that I've set for myself for my dedicated travel photography road trips. Everyone has different processes and routines, and maybe you have an entirely different approach, but hopefully some of those will be helpful for your next photography road trip. And if you find yourself in the Pacific Northwest and are looking for some help on planning a road trip out here, I will point you to my new Pacific Northwest travel photography guides on my website. They're entirely free. They're basically just blog posts, but you can go to brianwlackey.com/guides, and I make some suggestions on where to go and various tips for visiting Vancouver Island, the Olympic Peninsula, the San Juan Islands, Seattle, some other places around here. They're all very much works in progress, and I'll continue to update them as I explore and photograph more around this part of the world, but hopefully there's some helpful information in there for you. And with that, I'll say thanks so much for watching. Thanks as always for your support, and I'll see you next time. Bye.